8 seconds. Not 8 minutes. Not 8 nautical miles. 8 seconds. That was the entire decision window for the air boss aboard USS Gerald R. Ford on the morning of March 7, 2026. The time between a fire control radar locking onto an inbound Iranian loitering munition and the moment that drone crossed the threshold where nothing aboard the ship could stop it. 8 seconds to authorize lethal force. 8 seconds to decide whether the most powerful warship in the United States Navy fired its weapons in combat for the first time in its operational history. 8 seconds, and then one RIM-116 interceptor missile would either save the Ford or it wouldn't. The drone was already inside the outer defensive ring when they saw it. That's the part of this story that should keep naval planners awake at night. I'm your host at Navy Powerline. Today we're going second by second through the engagement that exposed a dangerous blind spot in Carrier Strike Group air defense and forced the Pentagon to rethink an assumption about sea-skimming threats that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Because what happened 340 nautical miles southwest of Karachi in the early morning hours of March 7, 2026, was not supposed to be possible. The Ford-class carrier is the most technologically advanced surface combatant ever built. Over $12 billion in acquisition cost. The AN/SPY-6 air and missile defense radar, the most powerful naval radar in history, capable of detecting targets at ranges that dwarf anything Russia or China can field. 3 layers of defensive systems. Electronic warfare suites sophisticated enough to track and classify contacts that earlier systems couldn't even see. The Ford was surrounded by a full carrier strike group, 2 guided missile destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, a fast attack submarine running surface escort, and E-2D advanced Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft overhead, providing 360-degree radar coverage extending hundreds of miles in every direction. None of it was enough. The Shahed-136 came in below all of it. To understand how a threat the size of a riding lawnmower, flying on a small 2-stroke engine at 110 knots, nearly struck the most protected ship in the world, you have to go back 6 hours before the intercept. You have to understand what the Ford's strike group was doing in those waters, why the threat picture had been assessed the way it was, and how an Iranian maritime militia unit operating out of a converted fishing dhow turned the carrier's own geography against her. March 7, 2026. Carrier Strike Group 12 had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea for 19 days. The Ford and her escorts had been conducting what the Navy calls sustained flight operations. High-tempo, around-the-clock sortie generation that kept F-35C Lightning II fighters, EA-18G Growler electronic attack jets, and E-2D Hawkeyes cycling on and off the flight deck in a continuous operational rhythm. The strike group had been positioned there as a direct response to escalating IRGC naval activity in the Strait of Hormuz and Gulf of Oman throughout February 2026, a period that saw Iranian fast attack craft conduct over a dozen provocative intercepts of commercial shipping in international waters. The Ford's mission was deterrence through presence. Carrier strike groups don't have to fire their weapons to project power. The mere fact of their existence in a region, 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered warship with a constellation of escort vessels and air assets, is itself a message to any adversary considering escalation. The Iranians had received that message, and they had spent 19 days studying the carrier's patterns, her flight operations schedule, the predictable rhythms of an American carrier that needed to conduct flight ops at specific times for logistics reasons, crew rest cycles, maintenance windows, and the fuel state of embarked aircraft. The detail that no one in the strike group's intelligence picture had fully processed. A 12-meter converted dhow registered to an Omani commercial fishing concern had been operating in the northern Arabian Sea for 11 days. It had repositioned itself multiple times. Its transponder data showed erratic behavior consistent with a vessel looking for fish. Its radar signature was indistinguishable from dozens of other small commercial vessels operating legally in those international waters. SIGINT collection from the region had produced no actionable indicators. The dhow had made no transmissions on military frequencies. It had emitted no radar energy of its own. According to after-action assessments, the dhow was a mobile launch platform operated by the IRGC's maritime militia, a network of fishing and commercial vessels that Iran has developed over more than a decade as a deniable, low observable force projection capability in the Gulf and Arabian Sea approaches. The vessel had been specifically modified to carry and launch Shahed-136 loitering munitions from a concealed ramp system installed in its cargo hold. The IRGC had been watching the Ford for 19 days. They had cataloged her flight operations schedule. They knew when the flight deck would be most vulnerable. Loaded with armed, fueled aircraft cycling between sorties, the deck crowded with ordnance, aviation fuel lines active, personnel exposed in the open air. At 4:17 local time on March 7, 2026, the dhow launched. The Shahed-136 is a one-way attack munition. It has a wingspan of approximately 2.5 meters, is powered by a small MD-550 pusher engine, and carries a warhead of approximately 40 kilograms of high explosive. Its radar cross-section is roughly equivalent to a large bird. Its thermal signature at cruise is minimal. Its maximum speed is around 185 kilometers per hour, approximately 100 knots, though variants optimized for sea skimming can sustain slightly higher speeds in level flight by sacrificing some loiter endurance. The IRGC had programmed this specific Shahed to fly its approach at less than 10 meters above the water surface. 10 meters, 30 feet, wavetop altitude. At that flight profile, the drone was below the radar horizon of every surface-based sensor in the strike group by the time it crossed inside 20 nautical miles. The physics of radar propagation over a curved ocean surface create a zone near the waterline, what naval planners call the radar shadow, where low-flying objects are invisible to ship-based systems until they close to very short range. The exact detection range for a sea-skimming target with the Shahed's radar cross-section, approaching from the northwest against a Ford-class Spy 6 installation, was later calculated in the after-action review to be approximately 11 nautical miles. The E-2D Hawkeye operating at altitude should have caught it. That was the assumption. The Hawkeye's APS-145 radar, or in the D variant, the more advanced AN/APY-9, is specifically designed to defeat exactly this kind of sea-skimming threat by providing overwater radar coverage from altitude, where the curvature problem doesn't apply. An airborne radar at 25,000 feet sees a surface target that a ship-based radar at 100 feet cannot. The Hawkeye that should have been covering the northwest sector had repositioned 12 minutes earlier. This is the first finding that comes out of the after-action review, and it's a painful one. At 4:05, the E-2D on station had received updated tasking from the CSG's Tactical Operations Center to extend its coverage arc toward the northeast to support a developing surface picture. 2 Iranian fast attack craft that had been tracked approaching the strike group's screen at medium range from a different vector. The Hawkeye's crew complied. They pulled their coverage northwest to cover the northeast. In doing so, they opened a 17-minute gap in radar coverage on the bearing from which the Shahed would approach. 17 minutes. The Shahed needed 14. The Tactical Operations Center had made a reasonable decision with the information available to them. The fast attack craft to the northeast were a real contact, a tracked threat, a known Iranian capability. The northwest sector had been quiet for hours. The request to extend Hawkeye coverage was standard procedure in a complex surface picture. No one in the chain of command made an error of negligence. They made an error of prioritization, drawn toward the louder, more visible threat while the quiet one closed from below the radar. One detail from the after-action review stayed with me when I went through the timeline. The radar operator in the Ford's Combat Information Center had flagged a very faint, intermittent return on the SPY-6 at 4:21, 4 minutes before the full detection. The return was at the absolute edge of the system's signal-to-noise threshold at approximately 14 nautical miles. It appeared twice, then it disappeared. The operator logged it as a probable sea clutter return and did not escalate it. That intermittent return was the Shahed briefly ascending above wavetop when it encountered a wave crest. It appeared twice, then it was gone. It would not appear again until the drone was 11 nautical miles out and the clock had already started. 4:25:17 local time. The AN/SPY-6 radar locked a confirmed track. Range 11.2 nautical miles. Bearing 312 degrees northwest. Altitude less than 30 feet above mean sea level. Speed 110 knots, closing. Bearing directly toward the Ford. The CIC watch officer had the contact classified as hostile within 40 seconds. The approach geometry, the altitude profile, the speed, the bearing. Everything pointed to one thing. This was not a bird, not a commercial aircraft, not a helicopter. This was a sea-skimming munition on a terminal attack profile. The watch officer's report to the air boss took 11 seconds. That left, by the calculations completed in the after-action review, approximately 8 seconds before the drone crossed inside the inner defensive perimeter at 800 meters, the threshold distance at which a SeaRAM engagement becomes geometrically marginal and a successful intercept is no longer guaranteed. Put yourself in the air boss's position for a second. You have 8 seconds. The Combat Information Center is reporting an inbound hostile contact closing at 110 knots. The flight deck above you, at 4:25 in the morning, with flight ops ongoing, is occupied by 3 F-35Cs in various stages of launch and recovery cycle. 1 E-2D being respotted forward, and approximately 60 personnel in deck handling, ordnance, and fueling roles. The F-35s are armed. The fuel lines are hot. A 40-kilogram warhead detonating on the flight deck at that moment would not just damage a supercarrier. It would trigger a catastrophic secondary explosion sequence, aircraft fuel, bombs, missiles that naval engineers and damage control planners have historically described as an extinction-level event for a carrier's combat capability. The air boss had 8 seconds to say 2 words: weapons free. He said them in 4. The SeaRAM, the rolling airframe missile launcher installed on the Ford's starboard quarter, is a close-in weapon system designed for exactly this scenario. A fully autonomous, self-contained point defense installation combining the RIM-116, rolling airframe missile with a fire control radar and a FLIR sensor suite. The system had been in continuous track on the contact from the moment CIC fed it the SPY-6 data. The moment weapons free was authorized, it didn't wait for a human to pull a trigger. It fired. The first RIM-116 launched at 4:25:31, 14 seconds after initial detection. It was flying in 3. There's an assumption most people carry about modern naval defense systems, that when a threat appears on radar and a missile fires, the outcome is settled. That a primitive one-way attack drone has no realistic chance against a $12 billion warship's defensive suite. That assumption is wrong in one critical detail, and this engagement proved it. The first RIM-116 missed. The Shahed had not flown a straight-line terminal approach. At approximately 900 meters from the ship, it had executed a pre-programmed lateral jink. A modest deviation in course, perhaps 15 degrees off its approach heading, before snapping back onto the attack bearing. The maneuver is small, but it was enough. The first interceptor, flying a pursuit course calculated on the pre-jink trajectory, passed the drone by an estimated 6 to 8 feet. 6 to 8 feet. The drone continued inbound. The engagement clock now showed a contact at approximately 700 meters from the Ford's flight deck edge, still closing, and one RIM-116 already expended. The SeaRAM had a second round in the launcher. The fire control system had already calculated a revised intercept solution accounting for the drone's new bearing. The second RIM-116 launched at 04:25:38, 7 seconds after the first. The second interceptor struck the Shahed-136 at a range of approximately 400 meters from the starboard deck edge. The detonation was low, almost at waterline elevation. The drone had been descending toward terminal attack altitude when the RIM-116 hit it amidships. The Shahed's 40-kilogram warhead did not detonate. The interceptor had destroyed the drone's guidance and fusing systems before the weapon could initiate. What did reach the ship was fragmentation. At 400 meters, debris traveling at terminal velocity covers the distance in under half a second. Pieces of the Shahed's airframe, carbon fiber structure, engine components, fuel tank fragments, peppered the Ford's starboard catwalk and the exterior bulkhead of several accessways below the flight deck. One piece of debris, estimated at between 50 and 75 grams based on wound pattern analysis, struck Petty Officer 3rd Class Marcus Webb, a damage control specialist who had been in a catwalk access hatch in the seconds following the launch alarm. Petty Officer Webb sustained lacerations to his left forearm and was treated aboard the ship. He was returned to full-duty status within 48 hours. The Ford never broke her launch cycle. Flight operations continued, but the engagement was far from over in terms of what it revealed. The after-action review convened aboard the USS Mount Whitney, the 6th Fleet Command ship, within 72 hours. The investigators worked through the timeline with extraordinary granularity. What they found in the data forced a fundamental reassessment of several assumptions embedded in Carrier Strike Group air defense doctrine for years. What strikes us about this engagement is not the success. The SeaRAM worked, the drone was stopped, the carrier survived. What matters is how narrow the margin was. This was not a comfortable margin. This was a margin measured in seconds and in feet, achieved by systems performing at the absolute edge of their designed parameters under conditions worse than any tabletop exercise had modeled. The doctrine that produced the deployment of CSG-12 had assumed a layered detection architecture that, under real-world operational pressures, had a gap in it. A gap that a converted fishing dhow exploited with a drone that cost the IRGC less than $20,000. The first major finding of the after-action review was the Hawkeye coverage gap. This had been identified immediately and was not surprising to investigators. The second finding was the Spy-6's early detection capability against a sea-skimming target at the Shahed's radar cross-section was measured in this engagement at 11.2 nautical miles. At 110 knots closing speed, 11.2 nautical miles equals approximately 6 minutes and 8 seconds of warning time, in theory. But the realistic decision-action timeline, detection, classification, reporting, authorization, engagement, consumed the overwhelming majority of that window. The engagement timeline showed that from confirmed detection to first missile launch was 14 seconds. Of the theoretical 6+ minutes of warning, the critical seconds that actually produced a weapons-free authorization and a launch were consumed by communication latency between the CIC watch officer, the tactical action officer, and the air boss. 14 seconds sounds fast. In the context of a 6-minute window, it sounds adequate. The review board pointed out that the 11.2 nautical mile detection range was achieved against a Shahed-136 at 30 feet altitude. A drone flying at 10 feet, the absolute wavetop profile that some Shahed variants have demonstrated in testing, would have reduced that detection range to approximately 7 nautical miles against the same radar installation. At 110 knots, 7 nautical miles is 3 minutes and 58 seconds. Against that timeline, A 14-second engagement process produces only the narrowest possible intercept opportunity. The board called it a compressed decision space. The term was diplomatic. What they meant was, the system was operating near its lower performance boundary, and the threat had not yet been optimized to exploit it. Here is the take that will probably generate some pushback in the comments. The Navy got lucky on March 7, 2026. Not because the SeaRAM missed its first shot. That was a narrow miss against a maneuvering target in a low-altitude engagement geometry that represents one of the hardest scenarios for any intercept system. The Navy got lucky because the IRGC chose to launch one drone at a time when the forward's defenses, though gapped, were still alert. The same after-action board modeled a salvo scenario. 3 Shahed-136 launched simultaneously from different bearings at 10-foot altitude on staggered timing to defeat sequential SeaRAM engagements. Their finding was classified, but sources familiar with the assessment described the simulated outcome as, quote, significantly less favorable. The IRGC's choice to fire one drone rather than a coordinated salvo was either a resource constraint, an operational decision to test the forward's defenses with a single probe, or a failure of coordination. The after-action board assessed all three possibilities. They could not rule out option 2, that this engagement was reconnaissance by fire, a deliberate test of the carrier's detection and response timeline, producing data the IRGC could use to optimize a future, more coordinated attack. What would you do with that assessment if you were the Pacific or Central Command commander reviewing this report? The carrier is operating. She's not damaged. She intercepted the threat. The official posture is that the systems worked. But the classified appendix tells a different story about margin. The diplomatic consequences of the March 7th engagement began immediately and on multiple tracks. The United States did not publicly attribute the Shahed launch to the IRGC for 72 hours after the engagement. The initial public statement from NAVCENT described the incident as a defensive engagement against an unmanned aerial system, without specifying origin or attribution. Privately, the intelligence community had high confidence within hours that the drone had come from the dhow, which had been identified and tracked after the fact when NSA SIGINT collected a burst transmission from the vessel approximately 30 minutes after the launch, a transmission consistent with a post-strike report to an IRGC Maritime Operations Center. The dhow was no longer in the area when a P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft arrived on station 2.5 hours later to surveil the launch datum. It had repositioned some 90 nautical miles southeast, mixing with coastal fishing traffic off the Makran coast. Boarding it at that point without additional evidence would have created a diplomatic incident with Oman and Pakistan simultaneously. The decision was made to maintain surveillance and not interdict. The dhow was tracked for 11 more days before it returned to Iranian territorial waters. It was not boarded. No action was taken against the vessel or its crew. The constraint that prevented interdiction came down to the rules of engagement governing operations in international waters and the legal threshold for attribution that would support a boarding under VBSS, Visit, Board, Search, and Seizure protocols. Signals intelligence was not sufficient alone. The burst transmission was classified and its disclosure would have revealed collection capabilities. The visual and forensic evidence, pieces of the Shahed that had struck the forward's catwalk, established that the drone had been launched from somewhere in the northwest sector, but did not by themselves legally identify the specific vessel. This is the tale that this engagement leaves behind, and it matters more than the technical performance of the SeaRAM. An IRGC maritime militia unit may have successfully launched a combat strike against a U.S. nuclear carrier, observed the results, potentially collected data on the carrier's defensive response timeline, and returned to port without consequence. If that assessment is correct, if the March 7th launch was reconnaissance by fire rather than an actual attempted kill, Then the IRGC now possesses validated data on what the Ford's inner defensive perimeter looks like under real combat conditions. Data they did not have before. Data that has significant value in planning any future coordinated attack. The After Action Review Board's third major finding addressed the question of why the Shahed's lateral jink was not anticipated. SeaRAM engagement parameters had been modeled against Shahed's flying predictable terminal approaches. The jink maneuver that caused the first miss was not a new Shahed capability. It had been observed in Ukrainian battlefield documentation of Shahed engagements going back to 2023. That data existed in the Joint Intelligence Database. It had not been integrated into the SeaRAM's fire control engagement algorithms for the specific scenario of a wavetop approach profile. The technical fix, a software update to the fire control engagement solution that accounts for terminal jinking in low-altitude targets, was reportedly pushed to SeaRAM installations fleet-wide within 30 days of the engagement. The process to generate that fix had taken less than 3 weeks once the after-action data was in hand. The reason it had not been done before was that the integration of Ukrainian battlefield data on Shahed maneuverability into U.S. Navy fire control software was categorized as a low-priority update against a threat scenario considered unlikely in carrier defense planning. The update had been in a software queue. It was given priority rating 3 out of 5. It had been waiting for a scheduled maintenance window. Petty Officer Webb's shrapnel wounds and the debris field on the Ford's catwalk moved that priority update to the front of the line. There is a line in the post-engagement report that reads almost like fiction when you encounter it in an otherwise clinical technical document. It describes the SeaRAM's post-engagement state. System conducted self-diagnosis, confirmed operational readiness, and returned to autonomous tracking mode within 4 seconds of second missile detonation. 4 seconds after a live combat engagement, the system had assessed itself as ready to fight again. The sailors on the Ford's starboard catwalk were still clearing debris when the SeaRAM went back on watch. The congressional response to the March 7th engagement split along familiar lines. The Armed Services Committees received a classified briefing within 10 days. Public testimony was scheduled for April 2026. At the time of this reconstruction, the hearing had focused substantially on 2 questions. The Hawkeye coverage gap that allowed the drone to approach undetected for 14 minutes, and the rules of engagement framework that had resulted in no action being taken against the launch vessel. The second question has produced more friction between the Pentagon and certain members of Congress than the technical details of the engagement itself. The argument that the Ford's crew intercepted the threat successfully, that the SeaRAM performed within its designed parameters, and that no personnel were seriously injured has been used by the Defense Department to characterize the engagement as a successful defensive operation. Critics on both sides of the aisle have argued that calling it a success is strategically dangerous, that it establishes a precedent in which the IRGC can conduct probe attacks against U.S. carriers without consequence as long as they are deniable enough to avoid clear attribution thresholds. The question of whether additional defensive measures should now accompany Ford-class operations in the Northern Arabian Sea, specifically additional SeaRAM mounts, expanded Hawkeye coverage arcs, and potentially the reinstallation of failing CIWS systems that were removed from the Ford during her modernization period, has been referred to the Naval Acquisitions and Force Structure Subcommittee. No public decision has been announced. Comment launch below if you think the Air Boss made the right call authorizing weapons free in 4 seconds. Or tell us whether you think the system as a whole failed the Ford that morning, even though the interception succeeded. The strategic consequence of March 7, 2026, will not be measured in the debris on a catwalk or the software update to a fire control algorithm. It will be measured in whether the assumptions that produce the conditions for that engagement, assumptions about IRGC capability, about maritime militia reach, about the reliability of layered detection architecture against sub-threshold threats, have actually changed. The Ford returned to her operational tasking within 24 hours of the engagement. She was not pulled from the area. She did not reduce her operational tempo. The official posture was continuity and resilience. The IRGC did not immediately escalate. There were no follow-on attacks in the days after March 7th. The maritime militia dhow returned to port. The IRGA said nothing publicly about the operation. They did not claim credit. They did not acknowledge involvement. Silence, in this context, is not reassurance. What this engagement reveals, and what the after-action review, the congressional testimony, and the fleet-wide software update all confirm, is that the gap between a carrier's stated defensive capability and its real-world performance against an optimized asymmetric threat is narrower than doctrine has acknowledged. The Ford class was designed to be invulnerable to exactly this kind of attack. The Spy-6 was designed to see this threat before it became dangerous. The SeaRAM was designed to kill it cleanly when it appeared. Everything worked. Almost. And that almost is worth more to the IRGC than 1,000 public declarations about their maritime strategy. One open question remains unanswered in every document, briefing, and testimony that has addressed this engagement. Whether the Shahed that hit the Ford's catwalk debris was carrying only its standard 40-kilogram warhead, or whether it was a modified variant carrying a shaped charge optimized for penetrating a flight deck. The warhead did not detonate. Forensic analysis of recovered fragments was incomplete due to saltwater immersion. The question remains classified at the SCI compartment level. Subscribe to Navy Powerline if you want to see how the Carrier Strike Group's response posture has evolved in the weeks since March 7th. Because the next video covers what changed in the rules of engagement and what the Navy is now positioning in the Arabian Sea that wasn't there before. The Ford completed her deployment. She returned to Norfolk in April 2026. The dhow returned to an Iranian port. Nothing happened to it. And somewhere in the northern Arabian Sea, the same gap between wavetop altitude and radar horizon still exists. The SeaRAM is still the last line, and 8 seconds is still 8 seconds.